Welcome to AI for Good, the leading, action-oriented, global and inclusive United Nations platform on AI. Organized by the International Telecommunication Union, the United Nations Agency for Digital Technologies, in partnership with 40+ UN sister organizations and co-convened with Switzerland. The goal of AI for Good is to identify innovative applications, build skills and standards, and advance partnerships to solve global challenges. In today's AI for Good event, we are counting on you to use the live video wall feature to ask questions and post comments to help create an engaging discussion. We encourage you to stay until the end to chat, connect, ask questions, and network with our distinguished facilitators and world-class AI experts in the neural network. It is now time to kick off the session and welcome our first speaker. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Future Leaders in Quantum pre-hackathon webinar series. As a reminder, the hackathon will take place starting May 16th and is open to everyone with 4 distinct tracks, including art, education, innovation, and science. There will definitely be fun and inspiring projects for all backgrounds and skill levels. If you're enjoying these workshops and are looking for some more hands-on experience, please head to the AI for Good website or visit www.quantumcoalition.io to pre-register for QC Flick. Today's workshop is titled Demystifying Quantum, Speak the Language of Impact. We are really excited to have Sierra with us, a journalist and analyst at the Quantum Insider and the founder of Universum Labs, an early-stage quantum and AI initiative focused on new ways to uncover patterns in scientific knowledge. Sierra is also the creator of the Daily Qubit, a widely read research digest that translates important papers in quantum for both practitioners and researchers. Today, she'll take us on a journey through the art and science of communicating complex quantum concepts as clear, engaging stories that bridge the gap between quantum experts and the general public. Sierra, thank you so much for being here, and I'll let you get started.
Thank you for that introduction, Sean. I'm very excited to be here and have the opportunity to speak on a topic that is very much near and dear to my heart. And I did prepare some slides for everyone, so I'm going to go ahead and share that screen. Let's see. All right, are you able to see my slides? Fantastic. Okay, so I am here today to talk to you about demystifying quantum. How can we tell the story using clear language so that we can reach everyone in the community from academia to the general public? A few different things we'll go through. So I'd love to do a brief introduction of myself, as well as what I see the problem is in communication and the proposed solution. I'll walk you through some of the core challenges that I see in my everyday work as a quantum journalist, as well as some storytelling techniques that I've picked up along the way. So starting out, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about myself, even though Sean did a really great introduction. I'll talk a little bit about the deep-rooted tradition of storytelling, and we'll talk about the importance of language and knowledge sharing, as well as both the art and education tracks of the hackathon and why communication is important. So starting out, as Sean mentioned, my name is Sierra Shukair. I'm a journalist and data analyst at the Quantum Insider. I've also founded my own company, which is still largely under development, and I'm working on building open source tools to support scientific knowledge and development. I also am a member of the Quantum Economic Development Consortium here in the US, and I sit on the advisory board for Girls in Quantum. So it's quantum all day, every day for me. So coming into our topic, I want to first speak a little bit about the importance of storytelling, because behind communication, it really is telling stories. it's important to recognize that before we had writing and science, before we had data and code, we shared stories. So from the very beginning, even before language, there were cave drawings that told stories to people, and then we started telling stories around the fire. So this is a tradition that's very deeply embedded in the DNA of who we are. In fact, you could say that it's a very human nature. Only humans tell stories. It's arguably a defining characteristic that sets us apart from other beings. Now, when it comes to storytelling, we immediately think of entertainment, but it's important to recognize that it wasn't just entertainment that we told stories for. These could be survival tips, it could be passing on cultural values, and most importantly, it's about the transfer of knowledge. Our ancestors passed wisdom through narrative because they knew that stories stick. So, unlike raw facts, stories really tap into our emotions and our imagination, which means that they create meaning for us. There's actually modern research that confirms that narratives help people understand, process, and recall information. So, it has a lot to do with memory as well. And ultimately, storytelling is about connection. So when we're telling a story, we're really inviting our listeners on a journey alongside ourselves. And there's a reason that all cultures have creation myths and heroes' journeys. They really resonate on a deep human level. So we're speaking the most natural language we have, the language of story. And this is really, really important for communication. And we'll come back to this. Now, I want to briefly spend some time talking about language. As a journalist and as someone who's written for many years, mostly for myself before I started writing in public, language is actually very important to me. I think of it as our first code. So it's about packaging ideas into signals. So with words and sounds, we can transfer our knowledge from our minds to listeners. And I think that's really profound. So if you think about conversation, lecture, communication, any sort of writing, we're essentially encoding information in a way that someone else can decode. And this is exactly what Claude Shannon formalized in the 1940s with information theory. So he spoke on the quantification, storage, and communication of information. So language is really our original information technology. So when we're speaking or we're writing, we're really sending little packets of meaning across the channel of voice or text. And then I see here, so from the beginning of time until now, we've had the oral tradition, writing, the printing press, the telegraph. So each of these were centered around preserving and transmitting information. And I think that this is really elegant because as we're considering how we are regularly pushing the frontiers of hardware with quantum computers, we also need to push the frontiers of communication with people. We're needing to communicate topics that are very complex and abstract, and we have to find new creative ways to do that. So speaking more about Claude Shannon, I have some stuff over here to the side on Shannon. So he taught us how to maximize a message through a noisy channel. And this is essentially the intention of communicating quantum. How can we get the message across in a way that it lands with the intended audience? That is the challenge. And then beyond just sharing information, this is sharing understanding. So it's really up to us as those who are actively working in quantum, actively working to translate quantum to the broader public. How do we start to share understanding? That is our task. And how this ties into the hackathon on a grander scale. So there are two different tracks, the art track and the education track, that are really centered around how do we make quantum accessible through inclusivity and impact. So some of the ways to do this would be through visualizations, through educational tutorials, through art, and each of those involves communication on some level. So this is really about the bigger picture of this year, which, as many of you know, it's the International Year of Quantum Science and Technology. It's this really incredible opportunity to communicate about the importance of quantum science on a really broad scale. And as someone who has really loved quantum for a long time, I find this really exciting because it's definitely not a topic that used to come up often in everyday life, but now we have this incredible platform that we can leverage to tell the story of quantum. And so I really see our role as communicators as quantum ambassadors. So we need to be able to translate quantum information to quantum understanding, as we were just talking about. And this will come up beyond the hackathon as well. If you are working with your original ideas, at some point in time, you might need to pitch that idea to a panel of judges or potential investors. And the success of great ideas often hinge on how well they're communicated. That is usually the defining point. So if we can connect technical developments with human stories, we can increase chances that quantum innovation will be funded, adopted, and expanded. So if you think about it, this is really about planting seeds for the future quantum workforce and the future ecosystem. It's really easy to start to think that the hardware is the most important piece, the research is the most important piece. But when it comes down to building a quantum ecosystem, communication is a very, very large part of that. It's essential that we as communicators can use our skills and our art to bring broader understanding. So a little bit about the very specific problem with quantum and communication. So the rate of development of quantum has really started to outpace public understanding. And this is something that we actively saw with the development of AI as well. I still can point to many friends and family who are not aware of the development in AI, let alone the development with quantum. So the more that we work with emerging technology, the more we realize that there's this gap between the technology that is developing and the public understanding the technology that is developing. So we have on one side quantum scientists and innovators, those who readily speak the language of quantum. On the other side, we have the general public. And this includes policymakers, this includes investors, this includes everyone who is not a specialist but will play a very special part in ensuring that we can develop large-scale quantum hardware. We need to make sure that quantum technology is understandable to a broader audience. And so focusing a bit more on the importance of public perception, this is no trivial thing. Public perception shapes funding, it shapes policy-making decisions, it shapes what we prioritize in education, and it also shapes the rate of adoption. And so if we look at each of those pieces, we have to understand that regardless of the development of the hardware, regardless of the incredible research that's coming out of academia, if we don't have funding, if we don't have public buy-in, if we're not educating the next workforce, then we're not going to see quantum technology adopted on a broader scale. Something really interesting that was published by the National Academy of Sciences is that only 16% of the public say that they actually follow science and tech news closely. And we're talking about all science and tech domains. So if only 16% of the public is following those domains on a large scale, it's a very, very, very small fraction of those who are following quantum news. So let's say that researchers are developing quantum sensors that have the potential to revolutionize medicine, or let's say we come up with some really groundbreaking quantum algorithms that directly influence the creation of new materials. Much of society isn't aware or engaged. And this really matters because, as we were just speaking about, Innovation doesn't happen in a vacuum. We need to have public perception. We need to highlight quantum technology so that we have that public interaction. Or else we risk quantum technology stagnating from a lack of support, or conversely, on another side, is starting to ramp up on the public fear. And so we've seen examples of this, again, especially seeing how AI has developed along the past few years. And also, if we look back, let's say to nuclear technology, there were early misunderstandings, there was fear, and this contributes to slowed programs and lack of funding. And we don't want quantum to suffer a similar fate, which means we need to have an eye on effective communication. And another problem we will talk about a lot today is when we have this gap between innovation and understanding, myths and misconceptions will rush to fill it. So the space will be filled. And that's something we'll talk about in a later slide and what that looks like. But it's just very important to know that innovation without explanation can really fuel inequality as well. So, as a small group of people pushes forward quantum, much of the public can feel left behind or even resistant. And this is also another great way to highlight what Future Leaders in Quantum is doing. It's bringing more people into the conversation. So, if we're able to identify these problems up front, then we can also empower ourselves to solve it. Why it matters. And we touched a lot on this in the previous slide, so I'll try not to repeat too much. But I really, really, really want to drive home that communication drives support. Understanding fuels progress. So when we think about quantum research and startups, those really thrive on funding. And much of that is through either public money, through government, or through investment. So that means that if policymakers, government doesn't understand the impact of quantum, or if investors shy away from investing in quantum, which we just saw happen recently, then we risk undermining the ecosystem we've worked so hard to build. So clear communication can directly unlock resources, which is very, very important. And as I wrote here, adoption hinges on understanding the benefits. So I probably can't drive this home enough. Communication is very, very important to establishing a solid ecosystem and one that continues to thrive. And I also want to pull in again the part on equity and quantum for all. So communication really affects who is able to participate. So we risk a divide where only a few, let's say, advanced nations or elite groups hold quantum expertise and power, and others will feel left behind if they're unable to grasp the concepts that we're putting out there. So in order to avoid this, we need to prioritize inclusivity in quantum. And to prioritize inclusivity in quantum, we need to ensure that we're speaking to diverse audiences. We need to invite students and professionals from all backgrounds, and that means they're coming in at all different levels of understanding. And so it's important that we see communication reflect that. We should see communication tailored for the younger groups, for K through 12, beginning to grasp the concepts of quantum mechanics. We should also see communication that helps existing professionals pivot from their current roles into potentially a role in the quantum industry. And so it's important that we always keep an eye on communication and ensure that it's not just dense jargon and difficult concepts. We have to be very intentional about the words that we put out there and how we explain these concepts. So I hope that these two slides have really built the challenges that we face in communication and why it is so important to demystify quantum.
Sierra, I wanted to just maybe ask a quick question about, and I'm not sure if this is something that you'll cover later, but what do you think the current situation is with communication? Because as far as I understand, there's maybe a bit of, there might be some quite damaging quantum related myths out there. And sometimes it feels that maybe the media at large doesn't quite get the quantum facts right. So I was interested in your perspective on what what it looks like right now.
Yeah, I think that is a really, really important question, Sean. And this is something I will touch on later in the presentation. But just to address it, I think that quantum and probably most emerging tech industries really suffer from the misconceptions that are put out there. I curated some headlines that we can look at in a bit that are very much quantum hype, and we'll talk about why it's damaging because we risk promoting misunderstanding. And so misunderstanding leads to two things. It can lead to people having the incorrect idea about what quantum can do current state, which doesn't really help anyone at all. And then we also risk promoting fear. So if people don't understand something, they tend to shrink back from it because it can be scary. We can become afraid of it. And so I very much do believe that we have a communication issue within quantum. I think we can extend that to a lot of emerging tech. And if we don't get a hold on it, if we don't promote the importance of communication, we risk driving people into inaccuracy or fear. So I hope that answers your question for now, but we will talk more about that in a bit. Okay, so great segue into this next section, which is the core challenges. So there are three core challenges that in my work in quantum, these are the ones I would identify that we need to resolve first and foremost. So the first one is that quantum is very abstract and largely unintuitive. And this is just inherent to quantum science. There's not much we can do about it other than tailor our communication to resolve it. And then we have the prevalence of media misconception. And then we have the last part, which is not just specific to quantum communication, but communication as a whole, is that it's important to recognize that different audiences have different needs. There we go. Okay, so first, let's talk about the abstract and unintuitive nature of quantum physics. So no matter what we do, quantum physics defies common sense. I have a picture of Richard Feynman down there in the corner who famously said that if you think you understand quantum mechanics, you don't. And the biggest issue with quantum is that even though quantum is happening all the time, whether or not we don't recognize it, we can't see it with our eyes. And humans are very visual creatures. If you think about the development from the child stage to adult, a lot of what we learn comes from our physical interaction with the world around us. We have to touch things, we want to taste things, smell things, interact with things. And when we don't have a certain level of interaction, we tend not to fully grasp a subject. And so this is just a challenge of quantum that we have to embrace. And so in order to resolve this, I think it really comes down to how we communicate quantum. Since quantum doesn't map to our everyday experience, explaining it is tricky. So it's important that we have to balance it, right? We need to bring quantum strangeness into the light, and we need to explain it in such a way without losing the essence. So that means we need to be very careful about choosing analogies. So we want to capture the flavor, the essence of quantum behavior, but we want to do it in relatable terms. But that comes with a caveat because we don't want to risk being inaccurate to the point where we've incorrectly explained the science. And sometimes it means acknowledging that it's non-intuitive. So saying, it's okay, this sounds strange, it is strange, but that's what makes it exciting. Another thing that we'll talk about later on when we look at a really great example of strong communication is when you bring in the human side of communication, humor and empathy, or just saying, hey, I completely relate, this is difficult to understand, that can go a long way. And so I put a quote up here by Dr. Shohini Ghozi, who famously said in a TED Talk, if you're confused by quantum, don't worry, you're getting it. So if you're confused, you're on the right page. All right, and then let's move forward. Okay, so the second one, and to further address your question, Sean, there are a lot of misconceptions in media. So I went ahead and picked some headlines that, in my opinion, do not do a service to quantum at all. So we saw last year, at the end of last year, with Google's Willow chip, there was a sentence that was taken out of context from someone who worked at Google, and it spread like wildfire among the headlines, and we ended up with ones at the top. Google quantum computer accidentally unleashed a parallel universe shift. And so that is largely inaccurate. And it really does a disservice on multiple fronts. One being it's inaccurate and people walk away not having a great understanding of what the technology actually does. And it also, in my opinion, really does a disservice in that it ruins the credibility of the field itself. So we know that quantum is not yet ready for large-scale applications. Everything that we're doing right now is we're laying the groundwork to get to where we want to be, and it will take a lot of hard work and it will take long timelines. And in order to get there, it means that we need to limit how much we put out harmful information like this that risks destroying the credibility of the science itself while the science is still being developed, because we want people to understand the reality of the hardware that we have currently, and the timelines that it will take to reach the scale that we want to get to. So other ones are, we see things that come out from maybe like they want to induce fear. So the quantum apocalypse is coming, be very afraid. Scientists simulated a quantum apocalypse, then the universe disappeared. I included a headline from a book called Quantum Supremacy. And I have a personal story with this. So before I was involved in quantum on a professional level, I read Quantum Supremacy, like a lot of other people who are new to quantum out there. And I read it and walked away thinking that I had an understanding of the state of quantum hardware. And I cannot tell you how wrong I was. And so I feel like much of my first year in quantum was spent undoing the myths that I had learned. And so this happens for myself who did study. I studied physics in university. I love science. I love learning. But it's easy to be fooled by these headlines that speak of revolution and transformation or apocalypse. And so it's really, really important that we're aware that this exists. And it's important for us to filter that out when we're reading material ourselves, but also as communicators, we must really take responsibility and be accountable for presenting the industry in the right light. And so what we do see in the media, the state of media, is a prevalence of hype, myths, and misused words. I see quantum leap everywhere. I can't stand that term. I don't know how to tell you how much it's just one of those things that you see over and over again, and it doesn't actually help you understand. And then I want to talk about why this happens, because we also see, as a journalist myself, is that sometimes these misconceptions happen and the intention behind the piece itself was good. Someone wrote a piece, they wanted to promote understanding of quantum science, but instead the reader walked away with an inaccurate understanding of quantum. And so that really comes down to, in my opinion, simplification. And so later in this presentation, we'll talk about techniques for effective communication, and one of them is simplify. However, if you oversimplify, you risk distilling quantum into something that is completely inaccurate, and then someone will walk away with less of an understanding of the field itself. And so I think that's a challenge that writers face on a regular basis. And so as we're continuing to write about quantum, that's one of the things we have to learn, is how do we simplify without oversimplifying? And I approach it as educators at the bottom. So overall, the main thing to do when writing anything about quantum is to go into it with the hat of an educator. Think, how can I take this complex topic and explain each piece of it in a way that resonates with my audience? And if we really, really tap into that side of ourselves that wants to learn and wants to educate and wants to teach others, that's when we can really do a really good service to quantum technology as a whole. And I found this quote from Scott Aronson, which I thought was really funny. Quantum computers, you might have heard, are magical uber machines that will soon cure cancer and global warming by trying all possible answers in different parallel universes. And we know that that is not true, but there are many pieces out in media that would make you think otherwise.
I wanted to ask a quick question about what you think. I think that perhaps there's an interesting area of communication in film. And there was this particular example of the Ant-Man movie being quite, got a lot of people excited about quantum, but at the same time mixed a lot of fiction in its storytelling. So I was wondering your kind of thoughts on whether you think there's a place for those kinds of mediums for getting people excited about quantum and kind of retaining that entertainment value, but also communicating uh, a bit more scientific accuracy in the way that it tells its stories.
That I love that question. And I have two thoughts that come to mind immediately. So the first is, on one hand, as you mentioned, it does a service in that it gets people excited about the science and the technology. So a lot like quantum supremacy, right? There are many people who picked up that book not knowing about quantum computing or really understanding that the quantum industry is actively developing. And they walked away with an excitement and perhaps even maybe encouragement to get involved. And so if we don't have some of these mediums, then we might miss out on really essential people joining the workforce. And film is, I think, very, very important to quantum because, as I mentioned, it's abstract. It's very difficult to visualize. And so the more mediums that we have to visualize quantum concepts, the better. But that being said, I do think that the creator of such a medium has a responsibility and should take accountability for putting out information that is scientifically accurate. And that often means a lot of additional work. It means working with scientists and professionals who are sometimes better equipped to help us understand and portray this in an accurate way. And then I think that the reason that it ends up so exaggerated is because sometimes the science, and I never want to say science is boring because I love science, but sometimes reality is not as exciting as we want it to be. And so there's that exaggeration so that, more people have eyes on your content. But it's just, I want to believe, and I think this really fuels me as a person, that science is wonderful and awe-inspiring the way it is. And if we just accurately portray it in the right way, we can induce that excitement without inaccurately portraying the science and doing a disservice to science itself. So yeah, I hope that helps answer that one. And then, okay, so different audiences have different needs. And I put down there one rule to rule them all. If there's one thing you walk away with out of this, I hope it's that the most important part of communication is knowing your audience. And this will play into every sort of communication, whether it's an email, a LinkedIn post, whether it's a film, whether it's a newsletter. Knowing your audience is the first part. And I also want to say that communication and storytelling is meant to be a selfless act. It's not for us, the writer. It's really for the audience. It's meant to serve your audience. So anytime you go to write something, you should always ask, how am I paying a service to my audience? How am I providing something of value to them? And the National Academy of Sciences By the way, I did put a link down here in the presentation. I highly recommend checking it out. They did write an entire report on science communication, but that people vary in what they need from science communication. And this is really important. So when we think about the general public, if the general public, they really need to know what impact will the development of quantum technology have on themselves, on their everyday life. And so it's possible that they might not need to understand on a very deep level how superposition and entanglement work. They just need to understand how quantum will impact their life. And that's the same, we can apply that same thought process to policymakers. Let's say you want to influence policymakers. You need to approach it not from I want to educate the policymaker on the exactly how quantum mechanics works, but instead from the perspective of this person is thinking about their constituents. So what impact will quantum potentially have on their constituents, and how will their decisions as a policymaker influence that? How will decisions around what grants to support or what programs to support influence their constituents? And so first and foremost, always consider your audience. That means that your message, whatever you want to get across, the message ultimately is the same on some level, but it needs to be adapted based on the person who is listening. And communication as a two-way event. So that really comes back to, first, like I said, communication is meant to be selfless, but then also communication is you telling the message and the person listening to the message is responding, or perhaps if you're speaking face-to-face, their facial expression or their gestures tell a story. And so adapting your message to better fit your audience. And we'll get into more in how we can address that. This is really the challenge, is that, I guess I didn't explicitly say that. So how this plays into a challenge is that what you will see throughout quantum communication is there are many different places where I think scientists can get very excited about their work. And so they'll start from a very technical level, and then the person who is reading about their work or hearing about their work doesn't really get the full impact of the message they were trying to convey. And so this is a really big challenge in quantum. And so what techniques can we use in order to better tell the story? So I'm going to go through these 4 quick. So we talked about earlier that oversimplification can be dangerous. So we want to avoid that, but we want to simplify. And so I found a quote: "Make it as simple as possible, but no simpler." And this is attributed to Einstein, but also many people said that it is not Einstein, so I left it as unknown. But something we want to do is beware of misconceptions. We want to tell the story without losing the truth. And I put this image up here as a nice visual to help me tell the story. But we want to consider any message that we're trying to give. We want to think of it as a block of marble. And so your first draft, you'll write down your message, and then you want to go through and think, is everything I put into this absolutely necessary for my audience? And so over time, you chip away at that first draft and you remove the words that aren't needed. You remove the flourishes that aren't needed, which can be very hard as a writer. And you end up with a simple message that can be very easily conveyed to your audience. It's important to use plain language when you can. And we'll go through an example in a bit of how to do that with quantum. It can be a little bit difficult at times. We want to break complex processes into steps one by one. So if something has several parts, then we want to do a step-by-step explanation. And people tend to respond really well with sequential events instead of having everything at once and risking cognitive overload. We want to do short sentences and clear structure. And I will tell you, as a writer, I struggle with this often. I want to tell this really visceral story, I want to make it poetic, but it's often that we need to come back and favor shorter sentences and active voice. So instead of saying, like, the phenomenon of quantum tunneling is facilitated by the wave function's non-zero probability density through classically forbidden regions, which means nothing to a lot of people. We might actually say, in quantum tunneling, a particle can cross a barrier it classically shouldn't, almost as if it teleported through. And then we could go into how, and we can break apart what's actually happening at a scientific level while still keeping everything clear and to the point. And then I also want to say that the importance of visual aids is it's very important. And so something that has come up again and again in the quantum community especially is the lack of visual aids that we have and the lack of even photography of quantum hardware itself. So when you think of a quantum computer, you often think of the golden chandelier, which is really the dilution fridge. And that's not what all quantum computers look like. That's what the superconducting quantum computer looks like. And so in quantum, we really want to start thinking about how can we bring more visual aids into the conversation. So humanize. We did talk about how I think it's really, really important to remember communication is selfless. We're putting people first. We don't write as writers for ourselves. We're writing to promote understanding in others. So we always want to put people at the center at everything we're doing. We're always asking the question of, what does this person need to walk away? What message do they need to walk away with? And we can do that by using relatable characters and scenarios. So using narratives that involve individuals. And really, as a writer, I think even pulling in your own experience as a person, like me saying, hey, I read Quantum Supremacy and I get it. It sounded exciting, but it's not quite accurate. So being able to share that personal experience helps people relate to you and then better relate to the message that you're trying to convey. There is really great power in personalization. And then the other piece of humanizing is not just for another person, but we want to think about society as a whole. So, especially with quantum, how can we focus on the impact that quantum can have on the broader challenges that our society experiences? So, funding, adoption, equity, all of these matter on impact. So, when we explain a quantum concept, we shouldn't always focus on what it is. And I feel that quantum communication can often really narrow, like we repeatedly go over what is it, but we really need to start telling people this is why it matters. So superposition is cool, right? But why does it matter? It's the reason that quantum computers have the potential to be very, very powerful and solve problems faster. So one impact is, let's say, a quantum computer could help design a new fertilizer that uses less energy. So we spend about 3% on the world's energy on making fertilizer. And so if we're able to use less energy, this would have a massive impact on food, on fighting climate change, on feeding the world more sustainably. And so that story makes a bigger difference than let's talk about superposition. So, and I think that as physicists and scientists and people who really love science, we think about superposition. We think this is really, really cool. This is why I get out of bed. But when we talk to the broader public, we want to think about how will this affect society, especially if you're thinking about policymakers and people, venture capitalists, and even industry. How can we directly impact them when we have the technology?
Do you think that there are some specific strategies that might be really effective in trying to kind of balance this humanizing, but also the concern that you know we could enter this kind of hype investment and then disappointment cycle because we don't want to communicate that it's where it isn't, I guess.
Yeah, I think that I think that the 2 really go hand in hand. Um, and so when we look at hype, we know that we can assume that a lot of the hype that comes from industry is because it does directly affect their funding. And quantum companies need a lot of funding because we need to operate over long timelines before we get a really big return on investment. And so hype does play into that. But I think that, and actually, I think it was at NVIDIA GTC, they had the Quantum Day, and the CEO of Quantinuum actually spoke on the importance of being honest with investors and the public, of saying, look, this is going to take a really long time. However, this is the return that we might get back, and it will positively affect society. Let's say drug discovery or personalized medicine. Like those are not small solutions. Those are really big solutions that would change life as we know it. And so I think if we move away from quantum is tapping into parallel universes as soon as tomorrow to quantum has the potential to provide medical solutions that we've never had access to, if we're willing to wait a few years. I don't want to talk about timelines. It's a contentious subject, but I think that we can still get to the point of really focusing on impact to tell a narrative that still speaks to investors and policymakers while still being responsible, accountable scientists and civilians. Um, yeah, I hope that answered your question. I think at one point I might have started to ramble a bit. Then let's move into conscious of time. So I'll try to speed up the next slides. So bring it to life. This one's really important to me. I think that the use of metaphor and analogy is already really important in storytelling and communication, but this is even amplified in quantum because, as we spoke about before, quantum can be very abstract. And so it's difficult to explain exactly what is entanglement or what is superposition. And so we want to use analogies and metaphors responsibly to more visually define the concept at hand. And as we mentioned before, we have to balance not oversimplifying to the point where we lose the scientific essence of the thing. And this is really great on metaphors and analogies can really make the abstract concrete. So I feel like that one's fairly straightforward. And I did put at the end something I want to call multimodal storytelling. And so I think that as someone who loves words, I love words, but I think there's a lot of power in trying to implement any visuals or diagrams. If you're creative and you can make film, personally, I'm not great at it, but if you can, that's another really, really powerful way to make concepts come to life. I think it's important to consider also in communication that our audience is diverse, which means the way that they assimilate information, the way that they learn is also diverse. So I know plenty of people that might not share my love of reading, of just being immersed in words, but can really take a lot from something that is sound, like an audiobook or a video, or even from really powerful imagery. And so the more that we can include those different mediums in our communication, the more impact we have the potential to make. And I also really wanted to take some time to say it's so important that we show up authentically and we are genuine, because it's the genuity that will connect you with your community. And so I think a lot of time as communicators, we have to put our work out into public. And so we go through this entire cycle of feeling fear and maybe pulling back. I've done this so many times, even in the past year. I pull back and I try not to put myself out there as much because it's the fear of being visible, of being seen. And really, when we show up authentically, it not only feels good for ourselves, it feels good to feel like this is me And this is who I'm putting out there. I'm not trying to be anything different, but you will also find that people gravitate towards what they see is genuine and authentic. And so it's very, very important that we make sure that that's present in all of our communications, because we will reach more people and have more impact if they trust us and invest in us. And another study found that in science communication, when scientists show their human side, so even something as simple as using I or we or maybe this made me feel instead of detached language, then we can increase audience trust and engagement. All right, so a couple of best practices, and we'll be able to wrap this up. How can we rewrite a quantum concept step by step? So we want to take something that has a lot of jargon and make it more clear. So something that I was really interested in when I started writing about quantum is I loved reading the papers on arXiv, because there were these fascinating developments happening in quantum, and you wouldn't see these published in a peer-reviewed journal for potentially up to a year. It takes a really long time. And so I loved being able to get in there and read these papers, and I got really excited about the idea of bringing these concepts to other people. But if you've ever read a scientific journal, you know that they can be rather dense, and most of the words, especially when I first started, I would stop word by word in a sentence to go find a definition or find an explanation. So it can take a lot of time to get through. So as a communicator, how can we take these really dense quantum subjects and make them more clear? So I have an example here. So the original sentence is, the transmon qubit state is manipulated via microwave pulses resonant with its transition frequency, enabling arbitrary single qubit rotations on the Bloch sphere. So to someone who has been in quantum for a while, you can probably read that and understand it. But if you're not familiar with quantum, then you probably stopped reading a couple words in and you moved to the next thing, because that doesn't appear to mean anything. So if we actually were to take the steps to distill this into a simpler message, we would walk away with, we can control a qubit by using microwaves to change its state. And that's a lot simpler, and that can reach a lot more people. We just really maximize the impact we can have. And I did want to take a quick note and say that there is a time and place for the original sentence. It just generally isn't for a broader audience. And so if we want to break down the steps it takes to translate difficult concepts into something more digestible, it would look like this. So we'd want to identify the jargon and the hard concepts. So we could start at transmon and say that's probably not necessary. And then we would want to explain or replace jargon in simpler terms. We'll rewrite in a straightforward way, and we really want to focus on creating simpler pieces. And then we would verify that we kept the meaning. We don't want to oversimplify or over-distill. And to make this even more powerful, we could couple this with visualizations or even additional resources for those who are interested in understanding the first sentence as it is. So I have two examples of really what I think, in my opinion, are very effective examples of communication in two different mediums as well. So first is a TED Talk by Dr. Shohini Ghosi, and she spoke on a beginner's guide to quantum computing. And so if you were to actually watch her presentation, she opens with a really, I'd say, light humor and relatable thing, where she says, as we talked about earlier, that if you are doing quantum and you don't understand it, then you're getting it. And so that one-liner, it seems really simple, but it's very important because it portrays a message, right? That quantum's weirdness is normal. Even experts find it weird. And it really stands to humanize her and relax the audience. And so now the audience is bought into her as an effective communicator. And so in her presentation, she uses a coin game analogy to explain quantum computing. So she invites the audience to imagine a game in a casino where a computer flips a coin that's hidden under a cup. And so by using this analogy, the audience is listening to our words, but visualizing it in their heads. And so they're actually able to follow along with the conversation. She's also very quick to bring impact into the conversation. So she explains like why she is excited about the future of quantum and the practical applications that she envisions will be the most important. So encryption, drug development, and information. And then she also shares her personal passion. And so these are all of the things that we talked about before is how can we be relatable? How can we use simple analogies? How can we focus on impact and also just remain genuine and really convey our passion for the subject? And then I also really wanted to highlight this book, which is one of the books on my shelves, Quantum in Pictures. This is by Bob Kuka and Stefano Gogioso. And so for those of you who are familiar with Dr. Bob Kuka, he's a phenomenal scientist at Continuum. He's also, he plays in a metal band, which I think is really awesome. And he's very passionate about teaching quantum more through pictorial methods. And so his whole thing is that he doesn't want to remove math from quantum because it's important. The mathematics is important, but he wants to create visual diagrams that better portray the concepts of linear algebra to a broader audience and also a younger audience. And so there was actually a study where he taught this method to, I want to say 12 to 15-year-olds, somewhere in that range, teenagers. And they did a comparison at the end of him teaching them through this method, where they were given an exam, and the way that they performed on the test was actually exceeded the way that a group of Oxford graduates performed on the test. And so there's two things we can take from this, and that is that visual, not to undersell the importance of visuals in your communication, but also we as humans have the ability to understand quantum at earlier ages. And so how can we bring that communication to younger generations? That is the conclusion of my presentation. So I hope that this provided value. And ultimately, I think that communication is about connection. It's about people. We're bringing together this ancient art of storytelling and modern physics. And I think that's really exciting. And that pushing innovation forward really, really depends on, can we convey a message that others can understand? And yeah, thank you for taking the time to listen.
Thank you so much. I think probably have two more questions. I think the first is maybe a bit of a fun one, but if you had to remove all technical terms from your explanation of quantum tech, how would you describe it? So I know you said analogies are really helpful, but how would you kind of picture it?
That is such a great question. So removing all analogies, okay, let's see if I can do that. So I would say this is a new, and I risk sounding cliche, a new paradigm of compute that would allow us to solve problems that we don't currently have the computational power to do. And it's relying on the fabric of nature. And I hope that doesn't sound too out there, but yeah.
No, I think that sounds great. I think maybe the last question is maybe this is more hackathon related, but if we only had a few minutes to present a project or an idea, what do you think are the best ways to keep it accurate, exciting, and clear? Especially if a lot of, maybe the students participating in the hackathon are still learning the concepts. And is it better to kind of lead with the problem or lead with maybe the more science aspects first?
That's a great question. I think that if you're constrained from time, you should always, always, always start with, this is how this will impact you, right? Because this is for your audience. So they are taking the time to listen to you. And so you want them to walk away with something valuable. So always start with, always start with the impact. And then if you have time, you can go back and you can very intentionally choose parts that you want to explain on a deeper level. It should be very intentional. It should be very relevant to the impact itself. But I would always start with the impact.
Amazing. Well, thank you again for your time and for your fantastic talk. And to our audience, we look forward to seeing you again soon with our next pre-flick workshop. And please check our website for more updates and pre-register for the hackathon this May. We hope to see a lot of you there.
Thank you for participating in today's AI for Good session. We hope you've learnt something new, innovative, and engaging in today's event. We now encourage you to continue the conversation on the live video wall in the neural network. Here you can ask questions, like and comment, share links, complete the poll, connect with interesting profiles, or speak one-on-one using the chat and video function. We invite you to explore the lobby, try the smart matching quiz, visit the virtual exhibits, poster boards, the e-shop, and build your personalized AI for Good program. Let's shape the future of AI for good.